Hi there, my name's Dan Weinbren and I'm going to talk about why did anybody bother to set up the Open University. I'm going to outline three aspects of the OU. Together they indicate that it was part of an effort to promote Western values and it helped to normalise the marketisation of social democracy.
Good afternoon. Programmes for the Open University begin in a couple of minutes with one for the community education course called Parents and Teenagers, A New Look.
First point is about the role of the state. The OU was a product of central government. It was marked down by the Labour leader, Harold Wilson, as having his personal imprint, his pet scheme. People talked about it being his priority, this University of the Air. And when it was announced, he did it without consultation with any of his colleagues in 1963. He then won the election in 1964 and appointed Jenny Lee MP to see the whole project through. She created a committee and then, unusually, chaired it and was closely engaged with it. She spoke of how that little bastard that I've hugged to my bosom and cherish, that all the others have tried to kill off, will thrive. When the Open University opened in 1969, pretty much all UK universities were indirectly funded by the government. The OU was distinctive in its role or its relationship with Whitehall. Many 1960s universities was a big expansion of them in that period, had been long in development. The University for Brighton had been discussed in the town for almost half a century before Sussex was opened in 1961. There were plans for a University of East Anglia, opened in 1963, dating back to 1918. And the seeds of Warwick University, opened in 1965, were sown in the 1940s. Although the OU had traditions and roots in the part-time education for adults developed in the 18th century, in correspondence courses associated with the rapid industrialisation of the 19th century, in the university extension initiatives which started in the 1970s, and in sandwich courses, summer schools, radio and television broadcasts, and little chemistry kits for kids, all precedents of those in the 20th century. The important developments which I'm thinking about here were in the period 1963 to 69, when it was funded directly by the state and run by a direct grant from the state. The implications of this were clear not just when Jenny Lee was setting it up, but also when subsequently the Conservatives took over. Margaret Thatcher was the Secretary of State for Education. He involved herself quite closely with the OU in 1970, and Keith Joseph, later on, he was a Secretary of State for Education as well. He responded quite vigorously to allegations of Marxist bias and included amongst his activities summoning the university's Vice-Chancellor to what proved, the Vice-Chancellor recalled, to be a very difficult interview. It's only in 1989 when the buffer of what was called the University Grants Committee was replaced, the weaker barrier against direct state control, and the OU was netted with other universities. So even early on, it was a model for how there could be control which wasn't simply academic control. The OU was part of a wider confidence in state intervention. In the 1960s, Labour had built a couple of concert halls and an art gallery on the Thames, lavishly funded the Arts Council of Great Britain. By contrast, the Conservatives favoured pirate radio entrepreneurs who flouted internationally agreed allocation of radio frequencies. The OU, for Labour, demonstrated the worthiness of state broadcasts. The 1969 BBC television series, Civilization, a personal view by Kenneth Clarke, showed the way forwards. Jenny Lee wrote, "I hope that Kenneth Clarke is going to present the arts course for us." The OU would be there to disseminate high culture. This is a notion of control which was adopted by others. Established in 1972, Franco's Spanish OU promoted an overtly Castilian agenda, while the University of South Africa, distance education, promoted a racist Afrikaans Afrikaner identity through racial quotas, Afrikaner domination and segregation. The OU's got different ideals, but it's the same notion of using mass media. And it wasn't only about culture. The economy was supposed to be supported by improved state education. This is the message of Labour manifestos and the 1963 Robbins Report on Higher Education. The OU would support scientific modernity and the reversal of economic decline. In 1968, there was a restructuring of the science policy machinery of the civil service, the Fulton Report, and the year earlier there was the Criminal Justice Act, which kind of tidied up and made more scientific how the courts were run. There was also an attempt to end unscientific practices in the workplace with a 1969 white paper on industrial relations. And that was the year when the government presided over the biggest car plant in Europe being opened at Longbridge. There's a picture of that just on your screen at the moment, amongst other things. Another aspect of this state involvement was to counter some of the radical ideas being presented and promoted in other universities. That most of the members of the Angry Brigade who'd faced trial for a bombing campaign in Britain, 1970 to 72, had been students was not lost on the press. "Dropouts with brains tried to launch bloody revolution," claimed one headline. By contrast, a Norwich paper reported on an Open University summer school said, "Short-haired students, keen to work." A third aspect of this use of universities was evident in a number of other countries. So the East German distance teaching materials were very overtly political, as were those in the USSR. And those were the sort of places, or specifically those places, which Wilson and other people had looked to as being cost efficient and a good way of promoting education. Particularly with Wilson was his US backer. There's a picture of this bloke just at the bottom of the screen, William Benton. William Benton had made a huge amount of money out of advertising and then worked in propaganda during the war. And he wanted to spread liberal ideas as a defence against communism. He was very much against McCarthy in America in the 50s. He argued that the Cold War between the open and closed societies is likely to be won in the world's classrooms, libraries, and college and university laboratories. So this bloke lavished gifts and meetings with influential men and an first honorary degree upon the rising star of the Labour Party, Harold Wilson, between 1960 and 1963. He also held a dinner for Wilson where he met Geoffrey Crowther, who was then vice chair of the editorial board of Encyclopaedia Britannica, which was owned by Benton, as well as being a governor of the LSE. And he went on, Crowther's the one who went on to become a chancellor of the Open University. Also at the meeting was Asa Briggs, another OU chancellor, and also somebody who worked for Benton on the Encyclopaedia Britannica. The first vice-chancellor of the university, Walter Perry, considered purchasing 280 sets of the 27-volume Encyclopaedia Britannica in order to equip the OU's study centres. So this is just one example of the OU accepting funding from private institutions in the US in order to help deliver the cultural elements of the Cold War. The other element within all this is that one of the people who was on almost, I think, all the committees which were setting up the university was a lecturer who'd worked for MI6 in Eastern Europe and was, I think, almost one of the only people to sit on both the initial committee of Jenny Lee and the subsequent ones, which eventually became Senate. The idea of education as a vehicle for soft diplomacy was also employed elsewhere. The OU played an important role in the creation of the Radio Open University, established in 1974. 3 senior staff, including a PVC, Pro Vice Chancellor, were funded by the government to help set up the People's Open University in Pakistan. And in 1975, the Free University of Iran made a 2-year agreement with the OU to create a multimedia distance learning system for the Shah there. The OU buttressed open learning institutions in the Netherlands, Nigeria, Suriname, Thailand, Venezuela. So it's got these other additional roles as part of this promotion of social democracy. It's also built on a very social democratic economic model. It provides a division of labour with short-term teaching-only contracts and specialist supports. Economically, the OU disrupted the conventional model by charging fees to students, while most universities in the UK did not, and also by selling thousands of its course units, its teaching materials, to both higher education institutions and also bookshops near campuses. The other way in which it was disruptive was it delivered to people's homes and used off-the-shelf components, notably books, telephones, gramophone records, state broadcasting equipment. And of course, even though it had home experiment kits, the items in them weren't necessarily new. Just perhaps the notion of sending out science kits was new. So before the Open University, universities were often inaccessible, expensive, and served the few. They were for full-time, wealthy young men. There's a picture of some of them in the middle of this screen. The OU didn't teach expensive subjects like medicine, though later nurses received degrees to the OU, and students didn't receive mandatory grants. Many worked and paid both taxes and fees. There were lower fixed costs as students used the libraries and buildings of other universities, and of course most lived at home. It is a completely different world to the Bullingdon Club of Cameron et al. So with all this, perhaps an important element of this is the liberal pedagogy, the liberal teaching of the university. In the past, correspondence and broadcasting materials had basically been one-way lecturing. Television was used by the OU to try and engender a sense of community, acting as a bridge between the academy and the popular, trying to help students feel closer to academic staff. Of the first 310 people to appear in OU television programmes, 150, half of them, were students. Everybody understood it in this way. It was very widely understood as such. According to the Times, it was a great liberal experiment. It sought to promote learning through the promotion of interaction and dialogue. And it often emphasised these learner-centred practices. In 1972, the intention of a psychology course film, which featured children talking and teachers at work in school, was for the OU students to hear, and this is what they said at the time, not the analysis of a lecturer, but the actual voices of teachers, children and parents. It was argued that the filter of the lecturer's personality has been effectively removed. A sociology film was made so that students could form their own opinions and use it as starting points for discussion. And a professor of history argued, "We attempt, in our correspondence texts, not to purvey facts and opinions, but to encourage the student to argue over and discuss various ideas." In 1972, a tutor who actually went on to become the Vice-Chancellor said, "Here were people who walked the talk on access and student-centred pedagogy." And the OBU was where students could learn together. When this person became the Vice-Chancellor, John Daniel, he sought to emphasise the values of the OU. He gave the example of the student, the graduate, who said with exasperation that ever since he studied with the OU, he'd been unable to see less than 6 sides to any question. John Daniel said, "This is what our founders meant by openness to ideas. That's a wonderful contribution that the OU is making to free, democratic and civilised society." OU was also liberal in its scope. Wilson welcomed housewife students, saying, "It doesn't matter if their degrees never earn them a penny piece." It's difficult to imagine Michael Gove or even Tony Blair saying it doesn't matter if their degrees never earn them a penny piece. The OU recognised that increased demand from baby boomers and those who are unable to attend university aged 18, and also those with disabilities and prisoners. It's recognised that demand, and it supported the idea of them developing as citizens wherever they were. So this slide at the top has got a picture of a prison in Northern Ireland where many men served their time in the 1970s. And a high percentage of those involved in the peace process in Northern Ireland studied with the OU. In addition, partly because of the pedagogy encouraged by the OU, they actually took on some of the course materials and modelled and made their own courses. A third aspect of this liberal notion is the individuals. Perry, the first Vice-Chancellor, was twice Social Democratic Party Deputy Leader in the Lords. And as another OU professor, Stuart Hall, noted, the OU was filled with good social democrats. Everyone there believes in the redistribution of educational opportunities and seeks to remedy the exclusiveness of British education. Of course, The OU had its critics inside Parliament, particularly the Conservatives, inside the civil service, inside the BBC, and inside the higher education sector. And those also shaped its development. It often strove to prove it was a proper, respectable, conformist university. That might explain, for example, its assessment strategy, which was fantastically laborious for many years. Over the Second World War and then the Cold War rivalry led to a significant increase in social expenditure. As one historian, Eric Hobsbawm, noted, Stalin was good for the common people in the West. When the OU was opened, its founding chancellor said it was going to be open to disembodied and airborne, in contrast to the closed bodies of the East. He went on to describe the human mind as not only a vessel to be filled with knowledge, but also a fire which should be set alight and blown with the divine afflatus. The state involvement was tempered by this notion of the market. This was going to be a cost-effective and efficient institution. There was going to be encouragement of sociable sense-making by learners. That is, social democracy was not simply an imposition, it was developed by staff and by students. And that kind of connects my three perhaps contradictory points. It's because the OU was an institution of democracy and took the ideals of social equality and equality of opportunity more seriously than other parts of the British education system. Because it took the university into the living room, it was able to render as habitual an industrial model of teaching, commercialisation and audit. This meant it could reinforce a notion of government engaged in and measuring what was going on in universities. What we see today, quasi-marketization, the hollowed out state, can be understood in terms of the history of the OU. Its social democratic roots enabled it to produce an industrial model of commodified knowledge. Okay, thanks so much. Bye for now.